Seldom indeed has a community been so swept by grief and mournful sympathy as Rutland was swept yesterday when the news of Bartley J. Costello's death became known. The feeling was almost universal, for folks of every age, race, creed, politics and business and social connection knew and loved him. This morning, all are mourning in his sudden taking off. Once in a generation, perhaps, one of these blithe and laughing spirits is born with a mission on earth to brighten and make happier those about them. Bartley Costello was one of those bright spirits, with a smile and a joking word for all, yet filling at the same time a businessman's place in this busy and prosperous community, and the head, front, and center of an ideal home life now so cruelly broken up. We say cruelly, and so it seems to us in the first wrench of our common sorrow, yet the faith he shared with all creeds teaches us that even in the anguish and misery of our grief, we must trace the workings of a great cause, so far inscrutable to our finite minds. Bartley Costello was not only the beloved teller of amusing tales, mostly redolent of his race and its native wit and humor. He was not only a singer of merry songs with a touch of his own personal knack as a parodist added on. He was a good citizen in its best and fullest sense. Coming from humble origins, he made his own way in business and took his full part in church, community, and fraternal activities. Meanwhile, with diligent and loving care, he cherished and supported the wife and the 7 children that filled their home and wound themselves about their hearts. He made friends by the score, and good friends stood always ready to give him aid and cooperation. But in the main, he made his own way, and such success as he attained came mostly from his own efforts. In the midst of many demands upon his time, he also found time to serve his city in a difficult and ever thankless task, yet taken on and carried through in his own philosophic spirit. Rutland and its community of neighboring towns are poorer by the death of Bartley J. Costello, and those of us who loved him are bereft indeed. I didn't actually grow up in Rutland. I grew up in Burlington, but we came to Rutland often. One of my earliest and favorite memories is of playing a unicorn at my cousin Katrina's birthday party. We had the little party hats and we were wearing them as unicorn and had a great time, and that memory has stuck with me forever. We used to come here all the time to visit our grandmother and Uncle Govey and all the other cousins and aunts and uncles who were spread around Rutland.
We lived on Killington Avenue. I had a great group of friends who were at Christ the King School where I went. We played Little League at Rotary Field, and we went swimming at the Rutland Swimming Pool, which is off Main Street. And then at Christ the King, we all played basketball. Same thing at MSJ, played down there. And I got out of MSJ in 1962. And that was, I never lived here again. I went to Holy Cross College, I went in the Navy, I went to law school, I lived in Albany. But I sort of never left, in a way.
My father was from Poultney. He was a doctor in Poultney for years. And my mother was a nurse, went to nursing school here in Rutland and practiced at the old hospital location on Nickel Street. And she met my father there. And they ended up moving to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So I was raised down there, but I was very fortunate to be able to come up to Rutland every summer and every Christmas since I was born.
My mom grew up with her family on East Washington Street, number 27, second from the corner. When my husband and I were married, when we came back to Rutland, our first apartment was 10 East Washington. And then the house on the corner came up for sale, which was 1 East Washington. We moved there, and we kind of felt like we were bookending the Costellos were taking over, and we rehabbed that house for 19 years. It was non-livable. It was no kitchen. It was a bookstore. It was a bookstore when we got it, and now it's a beautiful home. And when we were done, we sold it, and now we're actually living in my parents' house on Hillside Road.
And the best thing that I had was a family of cousins. We have, on my dad's side, over 40 first cousins.
I have 40 first cousins, and we all share a special bond.
They're all over the world at this point.
Honestly, I don't know that I could pick a couple of them out in a lineup because I'm at the end. I think there are only 2 younger than me.
We have cousins all over the United States.
And since I don't have brothers and sisters, that was very, very important and happy because I have 40 cousins. And it was like a huge welcoming family every time we'd come up here.
And we have one who has just been spending the last several years in Turkey.
And BJ is the oldest, and he's way older than I am, so.
I'm the oldest. Fortunately, I love it, really.
You know, there are a lot of us, and we're everywhere.
The Costellos have been in Rutland since 1872, when our great-grandparents came over from Ireland.
My great-grandfather and grandmother, Bartholomew Costello and Ellen Sweeney, came to Rutland in 1872 from England.
Bartholomew ran a pub in England. Ellen Sweeney was the barmaid, and that's where they met.
They were of Irish descent, but they left Ireland because there were no jobs, no work. There were the famines, and then there was the oppression by the British. So if a couple had a little piece of land they were trying to live off and they had 4 children, they couldn't divide it any further, so people had to leave. And then there was a lot of religious oppression also. So they went to England, they got married, they came here.
I'm assuming they came through Boston when they came to the United States. And how they ended in Rutland, I don't know. But because the railroad was a big part of how to make a living, I think that may have had something to do with it.
And they had a number of children, only one of which, Bartley, my grandfather, stayed in Rutland, Vermont. The others all went to Philadelphia.
My grandfather died well before I was born, but my dad used to talk a lot about his spirit and what he took from that.
So Bartley was a very ambitious young man. The family had absolutely nothing. They were educated at St. Peter's School because they lived on River Street, which was not too far from where the school was at that time. This generation of people and the generation before them helped to build St. Peter's Church, which was really interesting because you had the Italians who had a lot of talent, you had the Irish who had a lot of brawn, and between the two of them, and you had a lot of Polish people in the neighborhood also. So they basically built St. Peter's Church.
Bartley and his brother Joe opened a little grocery store. It was actually on the corner of West and Pine Street. And behind it, attached to it, was a cigar store run by his brother Charles Costello.
And it was a little grocery store. They had no capital, so how they did this, I don't know. But they opened it up there. And one day a woman came in and she wanted a fresh chicken. And he entertained her while his brother Charles went out the back door, ran down the tracks to their home, told his mother they needed a fresh chicken. Ellen went out back, took her hatchet, whacked off the head of a chicken, gave it to her son, who ran back down the tracks, gave it to Bartley, who handed it to the woman as her fresh chicken. And that was him.
The start of Carbon Costello started when my grandfather, Bartley Costello, and Bill Carbine, they were working for Mr. Hopkins, and he was ready to retire. I guess he had a clothing store, and he was ready to retire, so my grandfather and Bill Carbine decided to, let's see if we can make this work. So they flipped a coin, and Bill Carbine won, so his name was first, and it was apparently very successful.
So Bartley had the ability to talk.
And I had learned that he was quite a talker.
People would come into his clothing store and they would want to buy a blue suit, and my grandfather wouldn't have one, but by the time the person left, they'd have a brown suit and think it was their own idea and be very, very pleased about it.
The stories my father would tell about how he would sell somebody something in his store or just make a new friend, they were all about relationships.
He had that way about him. He would go any place in the state to entertain anybody for any good cause.
And I think that was something that came very natural to him, and it has come very natural, I think, to virtually everyone in our family. There's not a lot of wallflowers in the Costello family.
We're Costellos. We have the gift of gab.
And I'm quite certain that every single one of his children were given that trait, and I think that many of us in the next generation also have the gift of gab and persuasion.
He became the head of the state AOH, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. He was a vaudevillian with his sister Margaret.
Since he used to travel around when the kids were little to drum up business, he would go out on the road during the weekdays, and he did little vaudeville acts with his sister Margaret to drum up business for the store and tell jokes, and I guarantee you do Irish limericks or sing Irish songs or whatever.
And he was someone who raised money for people. He helped everyone out. My grandmother was exactly the same way.
Evelyn went to Teachers College, Boston Teachers College, which is a part of Boston University, I believe. And she got her teaching degree. My grandmother was down in Boston, and when she came up to Rutland, she went into Carbine Costello to meet a friend of hers who was the bookkeeper upstairs. And to get to her friend, she had to go through the gauntlet of salespeople that were probably very happy to see a beautiful young lady come in. And Bartley is the one that, I have a feeling he was quite the Irishman. That sums it up, because I think he had a lot of charm, and he went down to Boston to visit her, and because she was well chaperoned, the two women her mother and grandmother got to do a thorough investigation of him, and my grandmother decided when he came down to visit her that he was the one for her. And in those days, before they had anyone had cars, he would take her on long walks through the park, Main Street Park, or trolley rides to and from the popular dances that were at Lake Bomazene. There's a cute picture of my grandfather using Grandma as a wheelbarrow, walking her around on her hands. So I think there was a lot of playfulness there. They were actually married in Boston and honeymooned in Philadelphia and Atlantic City. And then when they came back to Rutland, the apartment that they were supposed to go into at 16 Washington Street had been rented out. So they ended up moving into the second floor at 25 East Washington Street.
There are just 3 rooms up there and an attic. I mean, it was tiny. I don't know how all those kids, they all shared rooms, obviously, but like, holy cow, I don't know how they did it.
And then, of course, There were a few children coming along. So that house, that rental house at 25 East Washington was getting more and more full. And then my grandmother was pregnant for Elizabeth. So Fidela, Evelyn's mother, decided that since 27 East Washington was coming up for sale, that would be a very good idea to buy that house. So she gave Bartley and Evelyn a $100 deposit to put down on that house, and then they moved into it just in time. And it made for a lot more room for the family. In 1928, in November, it was very cold, from what I understand, and Evelyn and Bartley, my grandparents, traveled down to Philadelphia to visit their cousins, the Kellys.
He had a new car, and so he and my grandmother decided to go to Philadelphia to see all the cousins because, as I said, all of the relatives had left Rutland and gone to Philadelphia, except for my grandfather. So he had stayed here. So off they went, and again, the roads were very difficult in 1928.
And on the way home, my grandfather started feeling sick.
And so they came back, and my grandfather was really exhausted from the drive.
He was so sick that he asked my grandmother to drive home the rest of the way from like Castleton home.
And he right away caught a virus.
The next morning when he went to Mass, he sat in the back because he was getting worse. And my grandmother was sitting in the front of the church. And when she got home, she found Bartley sitting in the parlor on the couch with a blanket over him, for just shivering, and he felt horrible. And that was Sunday. On Monday, the doctor came and decided to open all the windows of the bedroom. They didn't have antibiotics in those days, and my grandfather was so sick he couldn't even speak. He was on his deathbed. She told him she was pregnant, and he just looked up at her with this helpless expression on his face that he knew what was happening, and he couldn't offer any help or support. And he died that Friday. The wake and everything was held in the parlor. Again, more history in that house at 27 East Washington Street. My Uncle Dick Costello was just 16 years old, had just gotten his driver's license, and drove her to the hospital. The first one came out, and there was still a lot of action going on.
My grandmother was pregnant with twins.
And here she is suddenly in this situation with no family of her own, not having brothers and sisters, and her mother passed away, before. So it had to be very overwhelming. And then trying to figure out how to support 9 children, what she had to do.
One thing about my grandmother, I have trouble talking about because I feel so close to her. But when my grandfather died, at the same time, Mr. Rotella died. So the Rotella family is another family here in town. And Mr. Rotella came over from Italy, and he worked in a marble quarry. He was very successful. He became a foreman. And unfortunately, a big piece of marble struck him and killed him. So my grandmother and the Rotella family reached out. Yeah. And Guido Rotella, who's today in his 90s, is an awesome individual, still gives back to the community. His brother, Roy, and Guido Rotella went to school with my Aunt Mary Wing at MSJ. And Roy Rotella went to school with Aunt Evelyn and Joe. So that family became very close. And my grandmother, in those days in Rutland, I don't think the Irish and the Italians and everybody else mingled well, or other religions. My grandmother became very close to the Walk family. So David Walk, you probably know, but his grandfather was a merchant. He ran Walks, Tots, and Teens, and they were close to my grandmother. So all these relationships It's just, I mean, it's how we are.
Graham struggled to be a single parent.
When you look back at it, I took a look at the census from 1930, and it just, so this would be just after he'd passed away in 1928. And you look at the census at their home, which was at 27 East Washington Street. And so my grandmother was 42. Richard, the oldest at that time, was 17, so he was 15 when his father passed away. My dad was 15 in 1930. Elizabeth next was 12. John was 10. Edward was 6. Joan was 4. Mary was 3. And then the twins were not yet a year. So this is my grandmother at the beginning of the Depression with all this family. So how did they survive? They survived because they hung together. So people wanted to take them, you know, and split them up and everything else. And my grandmother said no.
My uncle Dick Costello, Richard, he just decided, you know, with all this responsibility pretty much staring at him in the face, he decided just not to go to college and stayed behind to raise all his brothers and sisters.
Uncle Dick didn't go to college because he became essentially the man of the house after our grandfather died, and he sacrificed his own opportunities to help the rest of the family.
He went to work for the Central Vermont Public Service Corporation. Harry LaValle, who's Monsignor LaValle's father, he's from Winooski. He was a principal at MSJ for a long time. He's beloved in Rutland. His father had Champlain Valley Fruit Company, and he gave all of them, Edward and everybody else drove the truck, the Champlain Valley fruit trucks all over the place. So they all had jobs, and Govey collected, when the girls got old enough and were babysitting, he'd collect their money from their babysitting. They all had paper routes. They all worked for the Herald.
Then there was Elizabeth, and she was a telephone operator. And all of that helped to bring some money in. The next child was John. And he was apparently, at the age of 8, dressed up in a sailor suit and would stand inside Carbon Costello to greet customers and to entice the customers to come in, age 8. And then there was Ed, who was also at the age of 8 to 9, was dressed up in a little admiral's outfit, and he worked at the movie theater as an usher from like 6 to 8 at night. And he would seat the people, and because he was afraid of the dark, would run back. And when the projection, you know, the movie would start, would run back and hopefully stand where there was a little bit of light. But then there was my mother, who babysat and became a nurse and contributed to the family after she did that. And Evelyn, also one of the twins, she babysat.
It's kind of a standing joke. My Uncle Joe, who was the youngest, had a paper route that later became Bill O'Rourke's, who's a local physician, became his brother Joe's, who's a lawyer at Ryan Smith. And those are the routes that Gubby and my dad had started way back when. And that's how they did. My grandmother did not go out and work for a living, and they were not on welfare. They just lived together, and everybody pitched in.
The community of Rutland was a huge support. Close friends of my grandmother's, the Praticos and David Walk's mother, Mrs. Walk, and those names are still very relevant today in the community, which is exactly another reason I love Rutland. People are very hands-on in their support with people in need, and I love that about this place. So they're close friends. My grandmother's close friends helped, and also the MSJ community. The nuns were very hands-on. They partnered with my grandmother as well as the coaches at MSJ to figure out what they needed to make sure they got a good Catholic education.
My dad was sent to Mount St. Joseph Academy, which was a difficult thing because that was a girls' school. He was in the second class of boys. You know, they all went to MSJ except for Govey because there was a girls' school and Govey was ready to go. And my dad, I'm sure, I'm glad I wasn't around to hear the conversation, but he was ordered off to MSJ. Again, he was a freshman when my grandfather died. So he was the first one to get down there. And those nuns and my grandmother just raised them all.
Really wanted her children to go to MSJ and to be able to have the opportunities that MSJ would afford them.
I really believe that my grandmother made an alliance with these nuns to raise his family, and that has been very important.
And each of the kids became class leaders with the help and support of MSJ, and were able to go on and really thrive through their own hard work as well to be successful people as adults.
My grandmother had great faith, and she had great faith in the Sacred Heart, which is a Catholic tradition. Turns out she wound up passing away on that day, that feast day, and so did my Uncle Dick. So for people, you know, the faith that we all have has really sustained us.
Graham struggled to be a single parent and really wanted her children to go to MSJ and to be able to have the opportunities that MSJ would afford them, even though they couldn't afford it.
My cousin Chris Wing suggested in 1993, he had an idea of setting up a fund called the Evelyn Gammons Costello Scholarship Fund. It was set up to specifically help single mothers that have children that would like to send their children to MSJ and to get a very good education but can't afford it or don't have that family support.
And so they did. They established this scholarship.
And that's been going since 1993.
I got to tell you, one of the requirements is that the children need to write a letter to explain what it means to them. And I've read some of those letters, and I would give them all full tuition if I had the means. They are so earnest about what they want in an education and why they want to go there. And then the thank you notes that they write, they're just so heartfelt.
So this is a way that we can help out in a small way, and it hopefully helps those children be successful when they graduate and give them a strong foundation when they go off to college.
It's a very nice program that they put together.
My Uncle Dick was nicknamed Govey, and I'm not sure where that nickname came from, but I'm assuming it was because he took on the role of the governor. He took the father role and took care of the household and raised his brothers and sisters.
Uncle Dick didn't go to college because he became essentially the man of the house after our grandfather died. And he sacrificed his own opportunities to help the rest of the family. And, again, that lesson of the greater good has been taught by members of the family, indeed, not by lecture or anything like that, for generations now.
My dad's name is Bartley J. Costello, and I am Bartley J. Costello III, and our grandfather was Bartley James Costello. So my dad was an awesome dad. My dad was the first in his generation to go to college. So my dad was a lawyer in Rutland. He was in the Marble Savings Bank building. And he was actually practicing law. This is only in Vermont. And the office next to his was a guy named Bob Stafford, who became lieutenant governor, governor, congressman, and senator. The next office over was a guy named Jim Jeffords, who became the attorney general and ultimately a congressman and a senator. So they were all on the Marble Savings Bank second floor, which was kitty corner from where Carbine Costello had been in the Gryphon building, which is still a clothing store today. So there were Costellos on that corner from about 1920 until close to 2000. My dad he was the head of the country club, the hospital, the Chamber of Commerce. He was on a bank board, as you know, everyone in that generation really was very successful. But he gave back to the community, and he'd been the first one who went to college in his family. And as a result of a scholarship he received at UVM, he had to devote a year back, which he wound up teaching at the Muddy Brook School, which was a one-room schoolhouse up in Williston, Vermont. And then came back home in 1937 and lived with my grandmother until he got married in 1943, because he and my Uncle Dick and the others were all helping out raising the family because there was no dad. I mean, they became the dad.
My dad was one of the last generation that grew up on 27 East Washington. He was proud of the fact that he began his working career when he was 4 or 5 years old, taking tickets at the Strand Theater after his dad died. And he really epitomized to me what it meant to be part of a community. He always led by example. He didn't talk a lot about things he did or the lessons he was trying to teach us, but it was very clear very early on to me that we were expected to be part of the community, not just live in a community. And I think that was something that came from his mother and his brother Dick, and the way the whole family was raised. You know, they benefited in great part from the way this community helped raise them. And I think that was a lesson that was passed along very early for me. You know, my dad was a judge in Vermont for 35 years. And back in those days, being a judge was a lot different than it is today. My father was the only judge in Chittenden County when I was a kid. And it was funny because he had, depending on who you're talking to, various reputations. A lot of people called him the hanging judge, but I think that was largely, people who had had a lot of problems thought that. My father was incredibly compassionate, and I think because of how he was raised, he understood the challenges that families had. The courthouse in Burlington was named for him. It's called the Edward J. Costello Courthouse. And he was famous for telling a kid who was in trouble wasn't the end of the world. He would sentence a teenager who had committed a crime to read a specific book and write a book report, or to learn how to play a trumpet and come back in a month and play in the court. He knew how to touch people. But he really led by example. My father was one of the bravest people I ever met. I'll never forget, I don't know how old I was, probably 12, 13. We heard a screech in the street, a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. My father went running out and basically saved a woman who was, guy was attacking her on the, had grabbed her at random on the street. And my father was not a huge guy or anything like that, but he was brave, and he taught us, I think, to do the right thing by example. My father never once, I literally do not remember my father ever giving me a lecture on, this is how you should do this, or you should need to do that, or this is the way life's supposed to be. Literally, I never had those conversations with my father, but I saw how he lived his life.
My mother is Joan Costello from Bartley and Evelyn Costello. My mother, I think my mother missed her father a great deal. She was only 2.5 to 3 when he passed away. And I think she was always looking for a strong father figure. Missed that when she grew up. She ended up marrying my father, who was 23 years older than her. And they were married 32 years. She always wanted a big family. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. I probably gave them enough to handle that made up for not having brothers and sisters. But my mother was very, very loyal to the memory of her father and held her mother in very high esteem, that her mother was never far from her thoughts. There was just a very close, loving relationship with her and her mother. And I think because my mother and father made the effort to come up here every summer and every Christmas, that, as well as all our other aunts and uncles, that's why we're so close, because there was every single Christmas Eve, 27 East Washington was filled with all those siblings and their children. And I have pictures. We were just on the floor everywhere. It was just wonderful. And I thank my mom for, making that effort to keep that close contact.
My mother, Mary Wing, was a Costello. But my mother was one of 9 kids. She was number 7. She was 2 when her father died. I am number 9 of 9 kids, and I had 3 sons. And that's as far as I could go. I wasn't doing 9 as well. I know that my gram was someone that my mother looked up to very highly. And my Uncle Dick, she could not say enough things about my Uncle Dick, taking over as a father figure for her. My mother broke into song all the time. And then there was Mary. She could fundraise like no other. She ran campaigns. She started a tennis program at MSJ for the girls and was their coach for years. A gal that I work with, Kathy Bove, she said, I used the Mary Wing method all the time. I call this one and I call that one. And I said, why don't you if you could just do this part, and if you could just do this. And I'm like, I didn't know my mom had her own method. My parents, when they first married, moved to Brighton, Mass. And then when they came back, they lived in a house on Division Street. And they lived next door to Henry and Helen Karras. So they became great friends, and I joked that, Mr. Karras took my mom to the hospital more than my dad because, he would be off at training or at whatever, and she'd be having another baby. But they both had the same wedding anniversary, 11 years apart, but they were great friends, and I think their friendship, being next door neighbors, helping each other out was rich for both of them. When they outgrew that house, they moved to Davis Street in this biggest house I've ever seen, as a little kid.
I used to love coming to the Wings house in Rutland. They lived in this beautiful house on Davis Street, and today no one seems to have a house like this, but they had a front staircase and a back staircase. And I just remember chasing each other up and down those stairs.
Up the front stairs, down the back stairs.
Thinking today, if kids were doing that in a house today, their parents would be yelling at them.
Out the door, around the yard, back in.
And our parents were like, just let us run wild and have fun. They would let us be kids.
We were just forever tearing around that house.
And just great memories. And walking to Kerrigan's, I can't believe I can remember the name of this store. Kerrigan's store was this little tiny store over on Woodstock Ave that we would walk to. It seemed like every time I came to visit the Wings. That house on East Washington Street and their house on Davis Street just had so many great memories for us.
And then when most everybody was gone, they moved to Hillside Road, and is where they lived out their last days.
And so my dad wound up going to Albany Law School in 1946 in a 2-year program. He graduated in 1948. And when he went to Albany, it was right after the war, and there was very little housing. So he looked around for a long time, but while he was looking, myself, my brother Tom were farmed out to Rutland. So my mother and Tom lived with their family on Roy Street, my mother's family, and I lived with my grandmother up on East Washington Street.
Some of my favorite memories of my childhood are literally just sitting in the parlor at my grandmother's and listening to her talk or banging on a piano, and I didn't know how to play.
We were mostly stuck in that one room with the fireplace. But I do remember going up and down those stairs a bunch of times.
Most of my memories are me sitting on the couch listening to the adults talk. There's such a history there. Children were born there.
Just being in that house, it was a magical place.
Just sitting on the front or side porch with her in the late afternoons, and she would have picked some wax or green beans from the backyard and just breaking off the ends and just spending time with her.
She had this kitchen in the back, and my grandmother made these molasses cookies that were, in those days, the size of my head.
I remember hugging her, and I remember the cookies, and I remember she wore an apron all the time.
My grandmother baked a lot, and I watched her bake, and I have a love of baking as well.
And she was 80 years old, and she'd make these amazing, amazing cookies still. She died when I was 12, and she was still, even when she was, infirm at the end, when you came down, there was always those cookies in the kitchen.
When I was in high school, my mother and I were up in Rutland at the house, and my grandmother was in bed, and she was ill. And I was standing in the bathroom, which was right off her bedroom, and my mother was standing next to the bed bathing my grandmother. And I just kind of walked out, and I saw what was happening. And my mother, without a beat, just turned and looked over her shoulder, and she said, "This is what love is, Michelle." And that was the most important lesson I could get and receive. And that's so true.
We were fortunate enough to get a lot of the furniture that came from 27 East Washington Street. And we had the parlor furniture, which was beautiful shape because nobody ever sat on it. You weren't really allowed. The matching couch and chair. And this chair, in fact, was my Grammy's chair. It's reupholstered quite smartly by Michelle, but, it was great to be able to have pieces that have been handed down.
I'm sentimental about the house because of the history. My great-grandmother and my aunt died there. My grandfather died and was waked there, but there was mainly joy, and so when I see the furniture that I'm lucky enough to have, it just, it makes me happy.
It's interesting. I don't know how Michelle comes across some of these things, but everybody, I think, knows that she is the keeper of all things sentimental. Yeah, she's got the piano, and she's got the buffet, and the shoes. I just found out about the shoes. There's a pair of shoes up there that I noticed in one of Michelle's books. Belonged to my Grammy from her wedding day, which is pretty neat.
When I moved up here and I had all of these wonderful items of furniture from my grandmother's house. It sounds silly, but I looked at the dining room table and I looked around and I said, well, Grandma, how do you feel? I'm 1 block away from your house. These things went all the way to Florida and came back. We're 1 block away. I said, if your house goes up for sale, it's a sign. But yeah, it brings me joy. I think of my family when I see the items, and they're all wonderful memories. So. I have family members that are continuing the example that our grandparents showed us by trying to keep Rutland revitalized. Steve Costello is one of them. I've been his main cheerleader.
If you look today, you can see Steve Costello has done a lot in Rutland.
Whatever he wants to do, and it's a lot, but I want to be a part of that. It's exciting. From the Red Cross blood drive to filling the cupboard, the food cupboard, from Rutland Blooms planting maple and other trees through the cities that need extra beautification and making neighborhoods proud of themselves.
Mark Foley, who is my first cousin Joni Wing Foley's son. He has done a tremendous amount here in Rutland. Mary Wing, who everybody in Rutland knows, who's an amazing woman who gave back so much to so many. And this is true about the entire family. Everybody gives back someplace, big time. I've been involved, so I head up a house for women in Albany who have been abused and suffering from addictions, 20 women. It's called The Next Step, and I chair that and have done a lot of work founding that and getting it moving. The USS Slater, which is the last remaining destroyer escort in the world out of 600 that were built in order to defeat the Nazi U-boats in World War II. The only one left is the Slater. That's in Albany. So I chair that board, and we've rehabbed that. It's really a very interesting story, raised millions of dollars to fix it up because people across the country believe in this, and you can walk on board. It's just like it was in 1943 when it was built. And I spend a fair amount of time with schools for deaf and blind children, as well as, I'm going to call them juvenile delinquents. Children who judges decide cannot live in a community but need to go to a residence. And there's about 100 of those in New York. And so I represent them, and I'm on their boards, and I spend a lot of time with them. So it's what we do.
All the community stuff that I've done has kind of come initially from work and then become something a lot more than that. The blood drive is a good example. It started as a work thing. It's still a work thing in a way, but it really came to mean a lot to Rutland, and for that reason, it meant a lot to me. And it, I always say it's become way more than a blood drive. It's a giant community party that Rutland has helped, grab onto and embrace, and I think get a lot of goodwill out of at a time when it started that Rutland was not in a very good place, 15 years ago. So I don't know, it's hard to explain, but the community stuff has just, one piece has connected to another, and relationships are at the heart of every one of the events and things that I'm involved in. And as the relationships grew, the opportunity to get involved in different things grew, and it just kind of happens almost organically at this point. My first day of work at CVPS, I got a call from this woman who literally demanded that CVPS put in osprey platforms to help this endangered species breed in Vermont. And there hadn't been an osprey that had bred in Vermont since the 1940s. And she was convinced that they would come back. There was one or two in northern Vermont that had not bred yet, and she was adamant that it would happen. And my boss was like, do whatever you want, I don't care, go ahead. If you want to start a little osprey program, go ahead. So we started an osprey program, and we put in a lot of platforms, and we did a lot of education about them. And ultimately, it took a long time. It took about 10 years, but ultimately, her foresight, her name was Miri Zetterstrom, led to the removal of ospreys from the endangered species list. And it was really powerful. It really showed what we could do as a company, showed how we could make connections in ways we never had dreamt of before. And so our community relations part of the company or public relations department really became the centerpiece of what we did. We still, talked and did safety things and that kind of stuff, but we really made a commitment to playing a bigger role in our communities.
I mean, I volunteer at the Historical Society, and I'm at the Paramount. I'm at the hospital once a week, and that's another awesome place to volunteer. It's an award-winning hospital, and there's a good reason for it. I used to be a nurse years and years ago, and in Florida, it's large medical centers. You don't have time to have a one-on-one relationship with your patient. There aren't enough nurses to go around, and it's very stressful, and the patients don't get the same type of care as Rutland Regional. I'm proud to be a volunteer there, and the dog park committee, that will be a little busy for the next couple of months, but hopefully we will get the dog park up and running. I make dinner once a month at the Dismas House with a group of other ladies. And we'll see after that. Probably I'll get involved with the Humane Society because my background in Florida was a lot of wildlife rehabilitation with possums mainly, and fostering and adopting dogs from our local Humane Society. So I will probably get my foot in the door down the road.
I was a part of Evelyn's Fund, which is my sister and her husband's creation to help kids in the community who are unable to attend art lessons or a dance recital or dance lessons or anything that their daughter Evelyn loved to do. Evelyn died when she was 6. She was my girl because I only had boys. And she was amazing. She was born with spina bifida, but if you didn't see her walk with crutches, you would have no idea that she had anything wrong. She had the best laugh ever. She had the most awesome ringlet curls, and she had a smile to just melt your heart. I loved her very much. So what they did to honor her memory is start this dance marathon because Evelyn loved to dance. Myself, my sister Trish, and my sister Ann, who are the 3 youngest girls in our family, we're all having babies at the same time. It's like, I'm having the first girl, because I'm going to get the name Evelyn, and I had boys, and she, after had boys, Ann had boys, and then Trish won. She was the winner. We were all the winners because we got to meet Evelyn. So Evelyn's Fund has, at this mark, raised over $125,000 and helped almost 600 kids do karate and basketball and camps and whatever it is they want to do. And next year, when Evelyn would have graduated from high school, they are going to disperse the rest of the money in the form of scholarships to the kids in her class going to college. I also was involved in a little thing called Baxter Scavenger Hunt. We did it twice to raise SIDS awareness. I had a son, Baxter, who died 16 years ago today. Don't know why. I will say this about my family, and I'm sure that my mom taught us from what she learned, is that when a tragedy comes upon you, there is no one like our family to surround you, to boost you, to help you in any possible way. I don't know. I know there are other families that have gone through. Everybody has something. I've learned that everybody has something. a lot of people don't have the support system that we have, and that was instilled in us by our parents, who in turn it was instilled to them by that generation. Now I get my bowlers together because we got shirts made and everything, and we pick a cause, and I'm like, okay, everybody, give me $25. We're gonna go bowling, and we're gonna give $25 to whomever. And I had a team for the Alzheimer's walk last year, and so we all went bowling and gave that money to them, and then our team walked in our bowling shirts for the walk around town, which was kind of cool. And this year we're going to do it again. But, you know, I think it's in my blood. My mother raised money for everybody, politicians, schools, teams, you know, what have you.
So there was this history of giving back.
I absolutely love all my cousins. They're all amazing in all different ways. Steve still is, annoyingly so, a lot younger than me, but he was a young man when I was in high school, and we really didn't know each other. And it wasn't until I moved here that we got as close as we are. But he has reached out on a weekly basis, like to include me in activities, just going out, and that is huge. It's you know, part of being from this family.
It's a really neat family. I think because of the way they were raised, they were, you know, our parents were incredibly close, much closer than my friends' families ever were when I was growing up. If I knew one of my aunts or uncles was coming for a visit, I made sure I was home. My friends just like, you want to go home and stop playing baseball because your uncle's going to come over? Like, you know, they didn't get it at all.
I have a cousin who is 2 months and 4 days older than me. And so, like, you know, we always palled around whenever we got to get together. Like, they came up for Thanksgiving every year. So us and the 9 of us, and Aunt Evie and her 6 kids, and Uncle Paul, and we had this huge room, and we just put all these tables together, and it was insanely awesome.
You know, we stay in touch. We help each other out. We do stuff together. It's
great to have family around, you know, and BJ comes so often, and so I get to see him, and I work a little bit with him on the Honor Our Past, only in that I do the programs for them, and so I get to get his input. I get to hear, you know, just, you know, connect.
We have each other's backs. We support each other. You know, if somebody's working on a project and they need insight on something that another cousin's going to have that insight on, they will call.
But, you know, it's funny because we'll get together lately, mostly at funerals, but at weddings and what have you, and it's like we never got apart.
That's just the way the family works.
Everybody cares about each other. You watch each other's back, good times and bad times, and that's what I'm most proud of.